So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessie Donahue, who's a professor of political science at Saginaw Valley State, where she teaches a class on animal politics and the law. She's a proud graduate of Boston College, and she's written co-authored a number of books on the topic of zoos and politics, exotic animals and their protectors, the public art in American zoos during the Depression. Our next project is focusing on the role of zoo directors in the 1920s. Dr. Donahue.
Thanks. Nice to be here. As I was thinking about this presentation today, I come from this both academic background and a family background of being someone who has had little kids anyway, and took them around to a lot of zoos for a long time. And trying to think, well, whose expectations are we talking about? Are they my expectations? Are they my kids? Are they, general American, trying to figure out this issue of who they were going to be? So it's hard to make a presentation from so many different people's expectations. So I had to kind of think about, do I approach this from a lowbrow or a highbrow kind of expectation? And my overwhelming sense is that zoos in the future will be approached in the same way that the best zoos in the past have been approached, and that is that people with highbrow expectations, in the sense of people who care about animal welfare overwhelmingly, scientific education, zoo accreditation, and all those kinds of things, will continue to be the people who shape the zoos of the future. That certainly has been, from my research, the trend of the past. That certain elite zoos in the past, like the Bronx Zoo, formerly Bronx Zoo, and the Philadelphia Zoo, and the San Diego Zoo, these elite kinds of institutions have people in them, visionary people, who then shape the future. So I think we can look at some trends today and what they're doing, and I'll refer to them sometimes through this presentation and say, I think that they and their visionary sense of animal welfare expectations will shape the future. So my apologies to people who were hoping for something about Ferris wheels or carnival rides and more of, taking the zoo in that kind of really popular recreation direction, because I don't think that ultimately that's what will maintain the zoos of the future. That may be there for revenue purposes as well, but zoos will continue to have a really heavy focus on animal welfare. I think that for those of the audience who love zoos, I think I'm going to share some opinions of other panelists here and say that some of the animals will be gone. I don't think all the charismatic megafauna will be gone, but some of them will, and I'll come back to them as I go through this. But I think overwhelmingly we will have increased access to animals at the zoo. We just talked about the issue of, going to see the animals at the zoo with your technology, but I envision that the webcam technology now at the National Zoo, some version of that in the future, I'm no expert in technology, will be very much with us. And I predict that that kind of technology will be so that the animals are actually, as most of the day, visible to people. Right now the technology is clunky. If the animal goes out of view, you can't actually see it. And so I predict that in the future those animals will have tracking devices and people will be able to watch and hear them all day long. And then that's going to create a whole new audience out there that already likes these animals, but that will follow them and get to know them better, and so on. And I think that has really big implications. One of the biggest implications is that it's going to increase the legal challenges against zoos. As I don't know how many of you are aware of this. I know my panel is very, very aware of it, but there have been lots of legal challenges to zoos. And so, the problem with the legal challenges in the past is that animal welfare and rights groups, when they've brought them, for example, one of the cases against the New England Aquarium, they brought a case about some dolphins and having some dolphins transferred to the Navy. And it's an emblematic case because what it illustrated was that the problem of standing, and that is that animal rights activists who wanted to stop that transfer could not successfully stop it because they could not accurately identify the particular dolphins in question. Some of them had come to the aquarium, New England Aquarium, to see the dolphins, but they actually didn't go often enough to be able to see them. But if the technology in the future changes, and I really think it will, and those webcams will be up all the time and people will be able to look at them all the time, I really predict that they're going to be able to see them, and that's going to increase their standing. They can say, look, and they can be able to prove I logged in so many hours every single week, and I know exactly which dolphin I'm looking at or exactly which tiger I'm looking at, and it's this one with these characteristics, and I've very definitely gotten to know that particular animal. One of the few successful court cases that ultimately involved a zoo was a case in which we had a member of the animal community who repeatedly came back to this Long Island Zoo and looked and really got to know these particular primates in question. And so because he could identify them so well, he was able to get the legal standing to file the court case. Ultimately, it was against the USDA and so on. But the issue is a lot of people will be in that particular situation in the future, and that's going to really increase the amount of attention that zoos are going to face in potential lawsuits. On the other hand, the positive thing for zoos is that not all those people will be looking to sue the zoos, and they'll also be looking at the animals as well and saying, look, these animals are being treated really well. I also was on the internet for hours and hours of my day, and I can attest to the fact that it was treated very well and very humanely and so on. So it's just going to be a much bigger group of people into the conversation than it's been in the past. I don't think the contentiousness will change, but you're talking about a lot of more people potentially involved. This will also have implications for euthanasia and animal transfer kinds of questions, and those have also been real contentious kinds of questions. When do we put down animals and when do we transfer them? For example, we've had cases in the Detroit Zoo in the past, had a case in which it wanted to euthanize some tigers, and the public was very much involved in getting in that situation. Again, they did bring a court case. Fund for Animals brought a court case against the zoo for attempting to euthanize those very sick animals. And so the public really was part of that conversation. So this will just increase. And so the zoo directors in the future will very much have to be constantly aware of the amount of scrutiny that they're going to be facing from the public because of technology. Same thing for animal transfers. But again, when that animal is transferred, and most of them are transferred very successfully and have very happy lives, they'll be able to show that and document that, and they'll be able to have a lot of witnesses that can see that as well. I see an increase in 100 years of human-animal interactions, physical interactions. There have certainly been problems in the past. The panelists here, I'm sure, are very aware of those. Really, violence from guests is one of the unfortunate major problems of trying to keep guests away from hurting the animals. Lots of cases of that in Missouri Zoo, St. Louis, and in Detroit, in Los Angeles, and so on, of people really taking terrible steps and hurting the animals. So that's one of the problems. Another problem, of course, that zoos face that you all are well aware of, but I'll review a little bit, and that is danger to employees and health dangers, and court cases of one at the Bronx Zoo in the 1970s, one in San Diego with a killer whale also in the 1970s. Those are real issues that zoos face even with employees. So of course zoos are going to have to be very careful in terms of how they make this work. However, I think it's going to work, and I think it's going to have to work because the competition right now is all about, swim with the dolphins, animal touch programs, and so that's going to be pulling away from zoos, and they're going to have to face that reality. I also think that we're sort of coming through institutes like this one and other kinds of programs, therapeutic animal programs and so on, really coming to understand the value of physical human-animal interactions that are monitored and safe and so on. And so I think we're swinging back in the pendulum away from the tendency to separate people and animals. And I think you see that, you already are seeing that. You see that, for example, in the New England Aquarium's website, where it's advertising itself as touching, programs where you can go and touch some of the animals. Aquariums have done that for a long time, touch stingrays and so on, sharks, and now you can do that even more. Aquariums are very much not accidentally, I think, on my mind, partly because of that touching issue. But I also see in the future, in terms of what the animal welfare expectations will be, I envision animal aquariums taking over stranding networks. And I think that comes from my background in political science. And that is what we know from political science is that political movements get co-opted by institutions. And so, for example, the feminist movement started domestic violence centers. And then the social work profession took those over. And so I think that probably stranding networks in the future will be taken over by zoos because zoos have, aquariums, have the facility to do that. And they have the money to do that. And I could see them expanding, actually, their numbers pretty dramatically along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. But they have to do that in connection with the animal welfare movement. They really have to work together with that movement as it stands now and establish a real credibility with that movement, lots of conversations with animal welfare activists, assuring them, bringing them into the fold in terms of employment at these institutions and making it clear to them that they're on their side and that they share the same agenda. And the agenda, from my perspective, in terms of aquariums, would be lots of rescues and reintroductions, doing what these stranding networks do now. A couple of years ago, our son was we have family in the coast of Northern California, and our son and husband were walking along the beach, and one of the little seals was on the beach and had been cut up in the face because people bring their dogs on the beach and let them run loose, and this particular seal, while the mother seal is out swimming, this particular seal had been cut by a dog, bitten by the dog on the face, and so my husband and son called the stranding network, and they came up and picked up this baby seal and took it to the stranding network where it was eventually rehabilitated and released. I think aquariums should be doing that. I think that should be one of their primary functions. They should be taking over that role and doing that kind of thing, inviting citizens into that perspective. I envision that those will be the main animals in aquariums. Obviously, I'm talking about marine mammals in this situation. But that will be much more of a function. I don't see beluga whales and killer whales in aquariums anymore in the future. I know that will be controversial, and I know we've had some panelists, at least one that I know of on this panel before, who's recommended against that, and we haven't gotten to that point yet. But I don't imagine that in the future. I don't know that we have the facility to do that. But lots more whale watching trips and so on. I think that zoos will replace sanctuaries as they currently stand in the future. I think right now we have a language about sanctuaries, and the word suggests to us, oh, it's a sanctuary, and therefore it's better, greater than a zoo, different than a zoo. But I think that zoos will start to take much more attention to that, as Ron Kagan has done at the Detroit Zoo, and say, look, we can be the sanctuary, and what is it about us that's different from those sanctuaries? And as I look at sanctuaries today, I see some of them out there that are just big cages. I don't really see that they're better places for animals, but they have the language of being a better place for animals, and I think that zoos will start to pay more attention to that and adopt that language and make it clear to visitors why they are actually the sanctuary for the animals and not the little place on the side that only a few people can see, and the few people who can see it often have to pay a whole lot of money to stay there and so on. Sanctuaries are often very unequal places in the sense of the more money you contribute, the more access you get to the animals, and we're talking like $10,000 for a sleepover at the sanctuary for the zoo, for that particular animal. So I think zoos want to think about, we'll think about that and raise those kinds of questions of, look at, what are the differences between sanctuaries and zoos have a real mission to play in the future. Obviously, I think the species preservation programs obviously will continue and will be dependent upon that habitat availability and political reality, and I know others will talk to that in much greater extent. And then I really, to finish up, I think that I expect that we'll see much more clearly articulated animal welfare politics from the zoos themselves. I appreciate and understand the need for an overwhelming focus on scientific education. That is literally something that zoos have to do by law. Without doing that, I understand that they can't, their mission is partly education, and that's written into the Animal Welfare Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and so on, that allows zoos to exhibit the animals. But really, I see zoos taking on more of a political mission. I think you can see that a little bit today, again, in terms of a role model for the future at the Wildlife Conservation Society. It's one of the only zoo I could find, there may be another one out there, that has a website link that actually urges visitors to take political action to help particular animals. The other website links at the other zoos tend to tell individual visitors what they personally can do for the environment. So use less water to water your lawn and things like that. But there needs to be more of an explicit political action agenda of the zoos in the future, and I think that it needs to be obviously that animal welfare agenda that links up with the larger animal welfare movement. And I see this even when I look at zoo directors themselves and what their role will be. And I hope a much more visible political role in the future. Zoo directors, whether people understand it or not, have spent a lot of time going to Congress and testifying on behalf of various major pieces of environmental legislation. And you don't really know that unless you do what I do and spend the time reading the committee hearings to know who showed up and who has lobbied and pushed for the kinds of legislation that the animal welfare and rights movement would really like. And so because they're not aware of that and because zoos don't communicate that with their larger audience of visitors, people tend to get this impression that they are not politically involved and tend to really underestimate the extent of zoo directors' concern for animal welfare. So I really expect to see that more in the future, and obviously I hope to see that more too. So that's my presentation for today.